Welcome back one last time, gang, to our fifth and yes, final section of our Chapter 20 lecture series for your textbook, Give Me Liberty by Dr. Eric Foner. This section is entitled The Great Depression. The focus question for this section is, what were the causes of the Great Depression and how effective were the government's responses by 1932? Most historians argue that the Great Depression was the greatest economic disaster in modern history. It's important to understand, however, that the stock market crash in 1929 alone did not cause the Depression, although it was the most outward sign of the economic troubles that undergirded the onset of the Depression. Before 1929, the causes of the Depression were myriad and really were woven together in this very intricate tapestry, if you will, of causality. And these signs of economic turmoil included real estate speculation and bust, unequal distribution of income, stagnation of automobile sales after 1926, a decline in European demand for American goods, a decline in farm prices, and bank failures, not to mention numerous other causes that are too numerous and varied to get into deeply in the interest of time here. By 1932, the economy hit rock bottom, with 25% of the labor force unemployed, the highest unemployment percentage in American history. The onset of the Great Depression initiated one of the most rapid transformations of American life in modern memory. People went from the affluence of the Roaring Twenties to often outright poverty within a matter of a few short years, or sometimes even a few short months. Bread lines proliferated where people waited in line for limited food supplies. Hoovervilles proliferated, which were essentially homeless shanty towns that emerged within and on the outskirts of major American urban areas. And of course, unemployment abounded. The Great Depression reversed the trend of migration from farms to cities, as many Americans in urban areas, destitute of work and destitute of any hope to find work, moved back to rural areas in hopes of establishing at least a small farmstead from which they could become self-sufficient. The suicide rate spiked and the birth rate plummeted. This was all coupled with the collapse of the positive image of big business that businesses and corporations had spent the entire decade of the 1920s trying to build back up. The investigations into the cause of the collapse revealed corruption and mismanagement in business, which fueled this collapse of the positive image of business and corporations in this period. Many Americans responded to the Great Depression with resignation or blamed themselves for their own economic troubles. And in many ways, the economic issues of the Great Depression were met with equal mental issues, literal depression about the Depression. Others, however, responded with protests, and one of the most famous or infamous examples of this were the bonus marchers, who were a bunch of unemployed World War I veterans who marched on D.C. to request the early payment of bonuses that the government had promised them for their service during World War I. Now, ironically, these veterans were put down by the military themselves, and who dispersed the marchers with no small incidences of violence involved. The press at this time discussed the idea that the country was on the verge of a revolution. There was a surge in Communist Party activity and popularity, which of course inspired fear among many Americans still reticent about such economic and political philosophies. Hoover's response to the issues of the Great Depression was essentially to do nothing, and to many the response was wholly inadequate and even uncaring. Hoover believed that providing direct aid to the unemployed was inappropriate and instead promoted belt tightening. Everybody should pick themselves up by their own bootstraps and just soldier through the troubles. Instead of government action, he put his faith in voluntary steps by businesses and private charity organizations. And as the Depression progressed and things seemed to get worse and worse, he seemed increasingly out of touch with reality to many Americans. Finally, the issue became so great that Hoover was inspired to take some government action. But the actions that the government took were in many ways very ham-fisted and wholly inadequate to the problem, and in many ways counterproductive to the issues at hand. One of the ways the government responded was by passing the Smoot-Hawley tariff, which raised taxes on imported goods, which further reduced international trade, which of course affected American businesses' bottom lines. Individual income taxes were increased, which further reduced Americans' purchasing power. Hoover finally did sign laws creating such organizations as the Reconstruction Finance Corporation and other relief measures, but he still opposed direct relief to the unemployed. In the 1920s, freedom was broadly defined by the unimpeded reign of economic enterprise, yet it tolerated the surveillance of private life and individual conscience. This definition was discredited by the Depression, and it inspired another liberal turn in American politics. For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. A new conception of freedom would come to define modern liberalism, which incorporated ideas of the socially conscious state, a government that is responsive to society's needs and society's ills, and also a respect for civil liberties and pluralism. And with that, we conclude our lecture series for Chapter 20 in your textbook, Give Me Liberty by Dr. Eric Foner. As always, I hope you learned a lot. Study hard, and we'll see you soon.